Whether it's on social media or at your child's school, the national conversation right now is all about guns.
And tonight we're kicking off a new KARE 11 investigation that uncovers a serious breakdown in the enforcement of gun safety laws right here in Minnesota. Here's investigative reporter AJ Legault with a failure to check.
Yeah, they're rolling over.
All right, guys. No, we're gonna start CPR. Does anybody know who this is?
Her name
1, 2, 3, 4.
is Julie Hildreth.
Come on, Julie. 10, 9.
Domestic violence ended her life
Heard a big boom.
in the doorway
She fell right in front of me.
of Aurora, Minnesota's American Legion on November 8th, 2015.
It was a deer rifle, I think.
And located shell casing right where my beam of light is.
A 30-06 shell casing was found in the bushes where the sniper had waited.
I was right with her when she fell down.
Randy Matson immediately pointed the finger at his girlfriend's abusive ex.
Who do you believe? John Flavel, her ex-boyfriend. You believe he did her new boyfriend. Okay. He's jealous.
Julie had left her ex, John Flavel, 2 months earlier amid allegations of domestic abuse. He was charged with criminal domestic assault, and a judge issued this domestic abuse no contact order. Julie told police she was afraid he could kill her because the violence is increasing. Kaylee Hildreth is Julie's daughter.
Took away a mother, a sister, a daughter, grandmother. All because he was jealous.
The domestic abuse no contact order clearly states federal law prohibited Flavel from possessing a firearm or ammunition while the order was in effect. But there's no evidence authorities checked on his guns. In fact, when questioned by the BCA after Julie's murder, Flavel admitted he had a semi-automatic rifle.
I keep it in the basement.
And had been using it to hunt.
This Saturday I use a 30-06.
The rifle in the basement, in a case labeled John's Auto, was a match for the shell casing found at the scene. Flavel was convicted and sentenced to 35 years in prison. But Julie's sister Vicky and daughter are left to wonder, why did he still even have the gun?
Something bad always has to happen before anybody does anything about it.
The loophole in the federal law is that while it says you're not allowed to possess a gun when you're under a domestic abuse no contact order, it doesn't require or spell out any sort of surrender of the firearms either. Now, Minnesota's law goes even further. It requires abusers to get rid of their guns and tell the court exactly what they've done with them. We found that's not happening. Our investigation, A Failure to Check, continues tonight on KARE 11 News at 10 p.m.
Well, guns are on the minds of millions of people since the school shooting in Florida. And now, amid this national conversation, a new KARE 11 investigation finds a widespread failure to enforce gun safety laws, specifically those designed to protect victims of domestic violence. At 6, we showed you how a domestic abuse victim was shot and killed by a man who, by law, was not allowed to have a gun. New tonight, another woman's fear that she could be the next victim, which is why she wanted to share her story. Here's investigative reporter AJ Legault with A Failure to Check.
I'm always making sure, looking through the cracks of the windows.
Desiree Nelson lives in fear of stepping outside her home.
He's kicked my teeth out.
She says she survived
He stabbed me with the serrated kitchen knife.
horrific abuse.
And it went on for a long time, and then when I got the strength to leave, he brought a gun into it.
For protection, she has to live in a secure facility, but now wants to tell her story.
He pointed the gun in the vehicle at me and my kids. Told me if I didn't get out, he'd kill me.
To protect women like Desiree, in 2014, Minnesota passed the Domestic Violence Firearm Act.
This is an action that I believe will save lives.
The law says, after an order of protection and OFP civil hearing, where a judge determines domestic abuse has occurred, the alleged abuser has 3 days to either transfer firearms to someone else or to police, for as long as the order is in effect. What's more, the law requires the abuser to file an affidavit with a court telling where the gun went. Desiree got an OFP after detailing to the court multiple gun-related threats.
Then they tell him to surrender it.
So what happened to the gun? We checked court files. There's no record her abuser ever filed the required affidavit. And there's evidence he kept his gun. 2 years after Desiree's OFP, court records show he was arrested for making terroristic threats, including, "I'm shooting you in your head, pow, pow, pow," against another woman who also told police he is known to carry a gun.
And then no one even checked, no one tried, no one said, "Hey, let's go make sure if he still got it."
No one checks? Is that true? We asked Hennepin County presiding family court judge Patrick Robin.
Right now, no one's checking?
Right now, it's up to the individual judicial officer, if they have reason to believe that guns are an issue, to then monitor the case and look to see whether that paperwork is on file.
That answer tells us it's up to the judge to check. But we wanted to know how often it actually happens. So KARE 11 asked the state court system for names and file numbers of every case in 2016 where there was an OFP that, by law, required a gun transfer.
The courts denied us access. They told us their records release rules require we get an order from the Supreme Court first. We asked the Supreme Court for that order, but again, were denied.
Despite that judicial secrecy, KARE 11 spent weeks poring through thousands of individual domestic violence cases we were able to identify. We discovered case after case like these. A gun used or threatened, but like in Desiree's case, no transfer affidavit filed.
They didn't make sure it got done.
Exactly how many cases are there where the abuser possesses a gun? There's no way to tell. But eventually, the courts did give us data without names showing the number of domestic abuse order for protection cases in 2016 automatically requiring gun transfer. Our analysis revealed in Minnesota's largest county, Hennepin, there were 598. Firearm transfer affidavits were filed just 11 times. That's not even 2%. Statewide, there were nearly 3,000 OFP cases. Only 119 have a firearm transfer affidavit. 96% of the time, there's no record the abusers gave up a gun. And in these 48 counties, there is not a single record of a domestic abuser transferring a firearm.
The only conclusion you can come to with that knowledge is that there are people who have guns that aren't supposed to have them.
David Kack is a former court commissioner in Wisconsin, now with the Battered Women's Justice Project. He says KARE 11's findings lead to another clear conclusion.
No one's checking.
Right now, no one's checking, yes.
A problem because statistics show more than half of domestic violence homicides are committed by people prohibited from owning firearms. 42% of domestic violence murder victims are children. And more than half of all mass shootings are related to domestic violence.
It happens more than everyone thinks, and nothing, absolutely nothing gets done.
Desiree Nelson chose to step out of the shadows and share her story in the hope Minnesota will get serious about enforcing domestic violence gun laws before she or someone else becomes the next murder headline.
What happens when he comes here and kills me?
Can more be done to enforce domestic violence gun laws already on the books? Well, you probably know the answer to that one. Tomorrow at 10, we're going to show you what extra steps are being done in Seattle and right next door in Wisconsin to get guns away from domestic abusers.
Well, I have to ask, Desiree, I was brave of her to go on camera, but I'm worried about her safety. I know a lot of people will be. Why would she agree to show her face on camera?
She wanted to show her face, and she actually told me my life can't be in more danger than it already is, and I want people to see what's going on and why this is an important issue.
Well, we look forward to tomorrow night where we look at maybe some solutions we could employ.
We're staying on this.
Great. Thank you, AJ. Well, if you are the victim of domestic violence and you're looking for help, there are resources. The number on your screen is for the Minnesota Day One Crisis Line. We've also posted it with this story on KARE11.com.
Well, last night, a KARE 11 investigation exposed a failure to enforce firearm safety laws designed to protect victims of domestic violence. Tonight, we look at what more can be done to get guns away from dangerous abusers. Here's AJ Legault with his continuing investigation, A Failure to Check.
I know this bill will not save every life.
It's 2014 at the state capitol. Lawmakers pass important new domestic violence firearm legislation.
But this is an action that I believe will save lives.
It's backed by two of Minnesota's most pro-gun rights legislators.
We put as much protection as we did with gun owners as we possibly could, and also protect a woman or a man from getting shot and killed.
The Domestic Violence Firearm Act mandates, after an order of protection, an OFP, civil hearing where a judge determines domestic abuse has occurred, the accused abuser has 3 days to either transfer firearms to someone else or to police for as long as that order is in effect. What's more, the law requires the abuser to file an affidavit with the court telling where the gun went. But 3.5 years after Minnesota passed that life-saving domestic violence gun transfer law, Carol Levin's investigation found it's rarely enforced.
There's no secret at all that he owns a gun.
A judge gave Desiree Nelson an order for protection after she detailed multiple gun-related threats from an abusive ex. But court records show he never filed the required gun transfer affidavit.
Then they tell him to surrender it, and then no one even checked.
She's right. Carol Levin's investigation discovered Minnesota courts rarely follow through to ensure the firearm transfer order is obeyed. Our analysis of court data for 2016 found statewide there were nearly 3,000 cases, and 96% of the time, there's no record an abuser gave up a gun. In fact, in these 48 counties, there's not a single record of a domestic abuser surrendering a firearm. We shared our findings with Liz Richards of the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women.
Clearly points to a gap.
How big a gap? Minnesota's Supreme Court refuses to release records that would allow Carol Levin to determine exactly how many of those cases involve allegations abusers had a firearm. But we found case after case where guns are mentioned, but no affidavit of transfer filed.
These are cases where we think the court should be taking action.
All rise. Superior Court is now in session.
In King County, Washington courtrooms, they are taking action.
Allegation that you had a weapon in your waistband.
Prosecutors and police formed a task force last year, specifically targeting the guns of accused domestic abusers. With social media, various databases, and most importantly, victim information.
The petitioner indicated that he twice threatened to kill her with a gun, pointed it at her and cocked it.
They identify firearms abusers may not admit to owning.
God is my witness, I don't have it, ma'am.
Using search warrants and other tactics, they've quadrupled the number of guns seized from abusers.
A year ago, none of these guns would have been recovered.
Closer to home in Wisconsin, courts hold a compliance hearing 7 days after the gun surrender order is issued to make sure it happens.
Without requiring people to come in and prove that they're following it, you can't just assume that they're doing it.
David Kack is a former court commissioner in Wisconsin who helped craft the state's protocol. He's now with the Battered Women's Justice Project and regularly travels to Minnesota,
working with Hennepin County right now on their firearm surrender protocol
to help design a similar pilot program here.
Needs to be done before there's a tragedy.
There's no shortage of tragedy. The Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women's annual femicide report shows in the last 5 years, at least 20% of the domestic violence gun-related homicides were by someone prohibited from possessing a firearm. Example, John Plavel, who killed his ex-girlfriend, Julie Hildreth, with a hunting rifle.
First and foremost, it's a safety issue for victims of domestic violence.
Hennepin County presiding family court judge Patrick Robin concedes Minnesota courts need to do better at ensuring compliance with gun transfer orders.
We can do more in making sure that that is a meaningful order and not just a piece of paper.
A piece of paper that, when enforced, could prevent domestic abuse victims like Desiree from becoming the next statistic.
They should take more initiative into making sure that men like this or abusers like this don't have access to weapons.
Well, today I heard from both the governor's office and a state lawmaker who labeled what we found extremely troubling. Now comes the tough job of wrestling with how to fix it. Is it new laws or better enabling the courts to follow up on the law that is already on the books? That remains to be seen.
Well, Carol Levin's investigation, shining a light on Minnesota's failure to enforce domestic violence gun laws, is getting attention from state leaders. Here's AJ Legault with his continuing investigation, a failure to check.
The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Guns, gun reform.
Raising the age is a good idea.
New gun laws.
We have so many laws, we don't even know what they are.
Packed public hearings at the state capitol, Firearms are currently the top topic in our state and nation. KARE 11's investigation.
KARE 11 had a report last night,
putting a spotlight on the fact that too often Minnesota courts fail to follow up on orders aimed at getting guns out of the hands of domestic abusers has become part of that conversation.
Right now, no one is checking.
No matter which side of the overall gun debate you fall on, there's general agreement that domestic abusers should not have firearms.
So when you combine that likelihood of violence with access to firearms, it's a very dangerous combination.
That's why back in 2014, DFL State Senator Ron Latz sponsored the Domestic Violence Firearm Act. It had broad bipartisan support and mandated abusers who are subject to orders for protection, OFPs, give up their guns and file an affidavit like this, telling the court exactly what's happened to them. But KARE 11's review of 2016 state court data found these 48 counties don't have a single record on file of a domestic abuser giving up a gun. Statewide, the gun transfer affidavits are on file in just 4% of cases. Senator Latz calls KARE 11's findings evidence of the state failing the victims of domestic violence.
Well, the system failed them in some way. It did. And we need to do a better job of protecting those victims.
He's now vowing to get to the bottom of the issue and take the steps needed to fix it.
Now that this has hit your radar, this is something you're going to follow up on?
Absolutely.
Well, Senator Latz says this is an issue that can likely be fixed without any new gun laws, but it needs to be fixed as lives could hang in the balance.
Over the past few weeks, KARE 11's investigative team has been shining a light on Minnesota's failure to enforce domestic violence gun laws. But tonight, we want to put a spotlight on the one county in the state we found making a concerted effort to ensure guns are taken out of the hands of domestic abusers. KARE 11's AJ Legault takes us to Roseau in our investigation, A Failure to Check.
Drive nearly 6 hours north of the Twin Cities, across the frozen, windswept plains, and you'll arrive in Roseau, Minnesota. The water tower brags it's home of snowmobile manufacturer Polaris. But KARE 11's investigation found it's also home to the most aggressive court in the state when it comes to getting guns away from domestic abusers.
I tracked down one, I called him.
Christine Osland is senior court clerk. It's her job
Case review
to keep close track of domestic violence cases. When abusers are ordered to get rid of their guns, they're required by law to file an affidavit like this, telling the court exactly what's happened to them.
And if the person doesn't
And
file,
Christine makes sure it gets done.
I would have to bring him to court to explain why he hasn't filed it.
A no-nonsense tone set by a feisty judge with a big laugh. Judge Donna Dixon, though, turns serious quickly when the conversation turns to domestic violence.
Because people get killed. I think it's something we have to take seriously.
Deadly, serious situations. But KARE 11's investigation discovered that, too often, Minnesota courts fail to follow up on orders aimed at getting guns out of the hands of domestic abusers. We identified case after case of domestic abuse where guns were used or threatened, the courts ordered they be given up, but then have no record of it actually happening. Example, Desiree Nelson's case out of Ramsey County.
Then they tell him to surrender it, and then no one even checked, no one tried, no one said, hey, let's go make sure if he still got it.
But Roseau is checking.
We've made it a priority to make certain that those guns aren't there.
Roseau County's efforts jumped off the screen when KARE 11 analyzed 2016 statewide court data of gun transfers in domestic violence order for protection cases. There's no way to tell exactly how many abusers possessed a gun, but in Roseau, gun transfer affidavits were filed in 73% of cases. The rest of the state, just 4%. Here's some further context. These 48 counties don't have a single record of a domestic abuser surrendering a firearm. Hennepin County had 598 order for protection cases and just 11 gun transfer affidavits filed. Roseau had only 15 cases and also had 11 gun transfer affidavits on record.
Because we've determined that as a community we want to make it a priority.
Judge Dixon won't comment on what other courts do or don't do, but says what's worked for her court is asking from the bench a key question.
Do you have any firearms in your possession or in your home?
Then, and this is what's different from what we found taking place in other courts, she's set up a computer alert system with her clerks.
It flags it.
To make sure, after she issues the gun transfer order, that there is follow-up to ensure compliance.
I can issue all the orders in the world, but if nobody follows up on them, it doesn't do any good.
It's not just victims like Desiree who are at risk.
But it also raises the danger for law enforcement if they're going into domestic situations where there are guns present.
The day we interviewed Judge Dixon, this was the headline in the Washington Post. A police officer murdered responding to a domestic situation. The killer, previously ordered by the court to turn over his guns, but it did not happen.
If there's firearms involved in the domestic violence, if there's firearms in the home even, you know, there's just that chance.
That chance that a bad situation can escalate to a deadly one with just the pull of a trigger. It's not a chance Rozo is willing to take.
Because domestic violence hurts our whole community.
We've told you Rozo is the best at enforcing Minnesota's domestic violence gun transfer law. By the numbers, the absolute worst is St. Louis County. In 1 year, they had 145 cases that qualified for gun transfer and not a single record of it actually happening. Is this something that is going to be paid much more attention to now?
Oh, absolutely.
Changes are being made in courts all across Minnesota in the wake of a KARE 11 investigation. It showed how domestic abusers are keeping their guns despite laws and court orders. Here's AJ Legault with his continuing investigation, A Failure to Check.
Whether you're pro-gun control or pro-gun rights, there is generally common ground in one area. Domestic violence and guns don't mix. When they do, the results are often all too predictable, as Julie Hildreth's daughter, Kaylee, can attest.
Took away a mother, a sister, a daughter, grandmother, all because he was jealous.
In 2014, there was broad bipartisan support at Minnesota's Capitol to pass the Domestic Violence Firearm Act. It mandated abusers subject to orders for protection, OFPs, give up their guns and file an affidavit, like this, telling the court exactly what's happened to them. But when KARE 11 reviewed thousands of cases, a full year's worth of state court data, we found these 48 counties don't have a single record on file of a domestic abuser giving up a gun. Statewide, the gun transfer affidavits are on file in just 4% of cases.
He pointed the gun in the vehicle at me and my kids.
We found case after case, like Desiree Nelson's, where domestic violence victims told the court a gun was part of the violence, but there was no record the court followed up to ensure the gun transfer order was actually obeyed.
Didn't make sure it got done.
After KARE's investigation aired, State Senator Ron Latz, the ranking minority member of the Judiciary Committee, vowed to get answers from state court administration.
What they've told me is that, first of all, they weren't aware that this was much of an issue. So just the reporting on it gave them information that was useful.
Among the reform steps taken in response, this notice was sent to all judges in the state, reminding them to order the transfer of firearms when appropriate and require the filing of a firearms affidavit.
And they're trying to create greater awareness within the judicial branch, and particularly at the district court level.
In addition, the courts created a new form for judges to use that allows those subject to orders for protection to attest under penalty of perjury that they do not own a firearm.
With this increased awareness, I think the judges are going to have to be more thoughtful about how they approach this.
Well, the senator says it remains to be seen whether these policy changes within the judicial branch will close the safety gap or if it will need a legislative fix. Randy?
Either way, they're much more aware of it now, though.
Certainly it is on the radar.
You bet. Thanks, AJ.